Hi there and welcome to this video. In a previous video I mentioned that one of the things I'd done during lockdown was have a bit of a tidy up, and I'd found some of my old cameras, including my very first ever camera, the Ryko 35ZF, and I even found the manual for this the other day. And you may have seen the videos I've done actually putting some film in this and shooting some images to see how it compares to modern mirrorless cameras. In my previous video on memory cards, I mentioned my first ever digital camera. And in this video, I'm going to take a brief look at it. Now, my first digital camera wasn't a Nikon camera, because around the year 2000, the only Nikon digital camera that was available was the D1, and that was released in 1999. It had a 2.7 megapixel sensor, shot 4.5 frames per second, and came in at about $5,000 US, so it wasn't really an affordable camera. After that, in about 2002, Nikon released the D100, and that was still around about $2,000 US. It had gone up, and it was a 6 megapixel, 3 frames per second camera. And it wasn't until about 2004 when Nikon released the D70, which was sub $1,000, that I got my first Nikon digital camera. So when I've not had Nikon digital cameras, I've quite often moved across to Fuji, and I feel I'm used to their menu system, I'm used to the kind of images I got from them. And my first digital camera was this Fuji Finepix 4700 zoom camera. I bought this in around about 2000, and just to give you a bit of background spec, it's got a 2 megapixel honeycomb sensor, and that gives you an image of about 4.32 megapixels, which was pretty good around that time. The sensor's a 1 inch by 1.7 inch CCD sensor, and it produces JPEGs with 2400 by 1800 pixels, which gives you that 4.32 megapixels. In relation to ISO, you could shoot in 200 ISO, 400 ISO or 800 ISO, so pretty limited in those days. And you could shoot anything from 3 seconds to 1/2000th of a second, and it's shot at 5 frames per second. So not too bad a spec for what was a pretty advanced digital camera in those days. One of the reasons I bought this camera was because it had a zoom, as the name implies, and that meant that the lens on this camera is an effective 36 to 108mm lens. It has an aperture of f2.8 to f4.5, so a pretty reasonable lens. The autofocus was okay, it was contrast detect, and on the back you've got a 2-inch screen with 130,000 dots. Not a touch screen, obviously, they only came much more recently. So why did I buy this? Well, firstly, it was about the best I could get for the money I had. I can't remember exactly how much this was in 2000. I'll try and find out and perhaps put it above, just to give you an indication. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't at the $2,000 end that Nikon were, or $5,000 that Nikon were looking for their D1 at the time. I quite like the fact it was quite well built. It's got this metal lens cover. It runs on AA batteries, which was great. And of course, 4.32 megapixels, it was a pretty reasonable image size. So what I thought I'd do is I'd get some batteries. I've got some memory cards for this, and I'd see if it works, because I haven't fired this up for probably somewhere well over a decade now. As I said, it takes AA batteries. In the bottom here, I've got a couple of these IKEA Lada batteries. These are quite good value, I find. That for a pack of 4, these are 2,450 milliamp hours, and they cost about a £5 for 4 of these. So this could be a very short video, depending on how this actually works. So let's put the batteries in. It's got a memory card in, and let's fire this up and see what happens. Well, we've got hello. We've got a card error showing, so let's try and see if I've got another card. The card is in this little flap at the side, and it's these rather large memory cards that, if you watch my video on cards through the eras, then you'll know these were quite an early type of card. I've got another one here. This is the one that came with the camera. It's a 16 megabyte card, I think. So let's put that in, close the flap and fire it up and see what we get this time. That's better. There's no error this time. This does come with a relatively weak flash, pop-up flash on the top, and you can use either the live view or this little rangefinder type view here. It's not an EVF, it just comes out the front and has a very rudimentary circle in the center for you to focus with. You've got these memory buttons around this little LCD screen up here to select zooming in and zooming out, I think. There we go. Yep, and it seems to be working all right. So on the side here you've got a USB 1 or a micro USB 1 format socket. From memory that's about 1.5 megabits per second, so not the fastest, and I'd need that to get images off here because I don't have a card reader for these memory cards. It's got a mic in socket and an AV out socket, and this does shoot video. On the dial on the top you select all the different options, including set, to take you into the menu where you can set the file size and everything. As I say, it does shoot video. It shoots, I think, about 80 seconds of 10 frames per second video. I'm not sure what format it is. There weren't that many formats in the days when this was around. So it'll be interesting to see what we get from this. I'll take a few photos and I'll put them up afterwards, and you can have a look at the quality of the images, but I'm going to have a bit of fun with this and see what we get from it. So this is the images out of the camera and straight imported, so at 1:1. This was fairly bright day. You can see there's a bit of pinkish and distortion on the image, but it was shot at 9.4mm. It's fairly fast for this camera, 1/390th of a second at f2.8 and ISO 200, so at the lower end of ISO. A pretty good image though, pretty sharp, quite a bit of detail in it, not bad for a 4.36 megapixel image. So I've tried to avoid doing too many images, but this is one I've taken at the telephoto end of the lens just to see how the image quality is. As you can see, there's a little less distortion on this, which is to be expected. It's in reasonably bright conditions, but the amount of detail in it is pretty good for a 20-year-old camera. So as with some previous videos, this is just a test for the sort of colour rendition with some bright colours. As you can see, it's very slightly desaturated, but then, you know, this is a camera that is probably about 20 years old with a 20-year-old sensor in it. So this is a high contrast scene with the bright sun in the top left and some backlit, slightly darker, shadowy leaves in the bottom of the frame. And actually I was quite impressed with how the camera handled this high contrast. It hasn't totally overblown out the sun. The backlit leaves are quite nicely exposed, and this is straight out the camera, remember, so a pretty decent shot. And then finally another relatively high contrast shot, this time with an apple in it just to provide a bit of colour, but what you can see is the camera is pretty well exposed for the leaves and the tree, although the cloud is very slightly blown out now. And this brings in, you know, there are very few controls on this camera, and that's where you realize the age of the camera. You know, there's no aperture priority or shutter priority on the camera, so you've got auto and you've got manual and a certain amount of control, but very limited control. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know in the comments below, which of your cameras are you still actively using from, you know, perhaps 10, 15, 20 years ago. It'd be interesting to see what you're using. I know some of you have done that in a previous video. What was your first digital camera? Do you still have it, and do you still use it? Or is it something you could dust off and see what quality you get from it and how it works and compares to modern mirrorless cameras? I do hope you enjoyed the video. As always, if you did, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and you'll be notified of future videos. And I look forward to seeing you in a future video.